Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast. Now, in the last episode on sleep and THC, we discussed the core relationship between cannabis and sleep. And in that first episode, we learned a number of different things. I described that cannabis and THC does come with some general health risks. If you look at the data, those range from cognitive and psychiatric issues to various health-related issues. Again, that's not to suggest that there aren't counter suggestions of health upsides. And once more, I have no horse in this race. I'm not trying to suggest going one way or the other on this front. But after speaking about those general health issues, we then explored sleep specifically. And here we discussed the really quite fascinating historical narrative of cannabis and sleep. And medically, at least, it traced all the way back to the 1800s. And there were two very intriguing doctors, Dr. O'Shaughnessy and then later Dr. Clendinning, whose observations really cemented in the medical archive, at least, how to put this, the sleep-inducing effects of cannabis and hemp resin, both in dogs as well as in their patients. But you may remember that one of Clendinning's patients that I referred to had a slightly different narrative. One of his patients was a habitual user of cannabis, and he noted that that patient had developed a tolerance. And as a consequence, his hemp resin that he was usually very confident in terms of sleep induction seemed to be ineffective in that patient. And I'm going to come back to that issue later today. And then in that previous episode, I told you about how cannabis acts on the body's natural cannabinoid system and specifically targets the CB1 receptor. And THC, by way of targeting the CB1 receptor of the cannabinoid system, produces the psychoactive part of cannabis, which is just a fancy way of saying it's THC acting on these CB1 receptors principally, but not exclusively, that gets you that feeling of being high. And you will recall in that previous episode that I said THC does indeed reliably make people fall asleep faster, and it decreases the amount of time that they spend awake throughout the night. And this seems to be why so many people will start using it as a quote-unquote sleep aid. And based on some evidence that I discussed in the last episode, it seems to be one of the reasons that they stop using their older prescription sleeping pills that they had been offered by their doctor. However, I also then unfolded the rest of that story, which is that those short-term benefits on sleep by way of THC and cannabis are really present mostly for naive users, and they don't persist for very long. In fact, over time, sleep quality often deteriorates with continued cannabis and THC use. And I told you that chronic THC use significantly increases the number of times, the frequency with which you start waking up, but particularly in the second half of the night. And waking up in the second half of the night means that it's usually much harder to fall back asleep than if you had woken up in the first half of the night. Why is that? Well, it's because of that thing that we've spoken about before, called sleep pressure. The more adenosine that builds up across your waking day, the sleepier you will feel. But then sleep gives you the chance to remove that sleepiness, that adenosine. So by the second half of the night, you don't have as much sleepiness, as much adenosine weighing you down. And therefore, it's that much harder to fall back asleep in the second half of the night than it is the first half of the night. And unfortunately, it's cannabis and THC that will wake you up, not really in the first half of the night. If anything, it keeps you more asleep in the first half of the night. Sadly, though, it wakes you up mostly in the second half of the night, and there you will find it that much more difficult to fall back asleep. But at the end of that episode, I told you that wasn't the complete story. There's more to the impact of cannabis and THC on sleep. To which you may be asking, well, what else? In short, dream sleep deprivation. Let me explain. Following a single night's use, and especially with continued chronic use, THC markedly interferes with your brain's generation of REM sleep. And the degree of that impairment of your REM sleep will be different. It varies across studies depending on things such as the dose and the naivete of those individuals. On average, THC will strip you of two different aspects of your REM sleep, and neither of them are desirable. The first is that THC significantly reduces the quantity of REM sleep, meaning the amount or how much total REM sleep your brain is able to generate across the night. The second impact is that THC produces as, if not perhaps even more of a sizable impairment in the quality of your REM sleep. And here you may be rightfully asking, well, Matt, what do you mean by the quality of my REM sleep? I get the quantity measure, which is the amount, perhaps the number of minutes of REM sleep that I'm getting, but what do you mean by quality? One way we determine the quality of your REM sleep is based on its intensity. And we quantify your REM sleep intensity based on the number of bursting, pulsing brainwaves that spark wonderfully into life, beginning right down deep in your brain in an area called the brainstem. And the brainstem, so long as it's not affected by THC, will impressively generate these powerful bursts of electrical activity. And those bursts of activity coming from deep down within the brainstem during REM sleep will then be volleyed out to many other parts of your brain. Emotion regulation regions of your brain, visual regions, memory-based centers of your brain. And what's interesting is that every time that your brain creates one of these bursts of REM sleep electrical activity, you will experience one of those rapid eye movement events, the darting back and forth of your eyes that define the name of this sleep stage, rapid eye movement sleep. And by placing electrodes above and below your eyes, that is how we measure the intensity, the quality of your REM sleep. How many of those rapid eye movements are you getting? How frequently are they occurring? And that gives us an inference as to how many of those bursting brainstem up into your cortex bolts of electrical REM sleep quality you are getting. And what we've discovered is that THC, even at really quite low doses, seems to have a tranquilizing effect on these signature bursts of electrical activity at night during REM sleep. And if you average across the studies and different doses, you will typically reduce your REM sleep intensity by around 40%, 40. And this is true whether we've done research studies dosing you with a crude preparation of cannabis, something that would be equivalent to that which you buy recreationally, or a pharmaceutical grade pure version of THC. And if THC impairs the quality of your REM sleep, what then do those types of impairments in REM sleep mean for you, for your brain, for your body, even for your lifespan? This episode is supported by the fine folks at the Washington Post. When it comes to news, and including my obsession, which is science and medicine and health, I rely on high-quality reporting outlets of real integrity. That's why I'm so happy to partner with them. And yes, for those of you who know, I am signed up to the For You newsletter. And it provides me with my own personalized roundup of stories every day based on my interests and my reading history. It's really fantastic. It is my trusted news source. And if you are a listener to this show, you can now get the Washington Post at a fraction of the normal price. If you go to washingtonpost.com/Matt Walker, you will be able to get the Washington Post for an entire year for just 50 cents per week. Yep, 50 cents per week. I have no idea why they have done this for me. It makes no financial sense for them whatsoever. Again, just go over to washingtonpost.com/Matt Walker and you will get the Washington Post for 50 cents a week for an entire year. So again, washingtonpost.com/Matt Walker. As I've mentioned before in our prior episode series on sleep and alcohol, REM sleep serves numerous different critical functions for your mental health. One of the things that REM sleep provides is a form of overnight therapy. It is a form of emotional first aid. In addition, we know that REM sleep strongly alters your learning and your memory and your creativity abilities. For example, there have been some really quite intriguing studies in rats and in humans showing that the more intense your REM sleep, the more of those rapid eye movements that you're getting based on those pulses of brainwave activity, the better your learning and memory retention the next day. And if you're listening to this and those things, those aspects of your learning and memory or your mood and your emotional regulation feel diminished or impaired, and you are using THC, it may just be something to keep in mind. But that isn't just where the benefits of REM sleep stop. We've been able to add to that health list a number of other associations. For example, we know that the less REM sleep that middle and older age males have, the lower their levels of testosterone. And keep in mind that deficient levels of testosterone predict increased cardiovascular disease, cardiac failure, diabetes, prostate disease, dementia, as well as bone fracture risk. And that is in both men and in women as well. Testosterone is critical for female health. Oh, and I should speak about, it was a recent large-scale assessment of outright death risk in almost 4,000 individuals. And it's relevant to THC because in that study, what they found was that for every 5% reduction in REM sleep, just 5% reduction, there was an associated 13% increase in mortality death risk. And that effect, they reported, was linear, meaning that there was no harm in getting more and more REM sleep. And in a very clever analysis at the end of that paper, the scientists went on to demonstrate that of all of the different sleep metrics, if you measure them all and throw them all in a big statistical bucket, it was REM sleep that was the single most important sleep stage associated with survival. Coming back to it then, when REM sleep is compromised by cannabis, be it less total REM sleep amount or a reduction in the quality of that REM sleep, the intensity of those eye movements, one can perhaps expect both brain and body challenges. Indeed, you may even perceive this yourself. When subjects are asked themselves, how do they feel about their levels of alertness after an evening dose of 15 milligrams of THC, or even a combined dose of 15 milligrams of THC and CBD, the effects are really quite clear. Both drug conditions, both THC alone and THC plus CBD, led to participants saying that they just felt a lot sleepier and groggier the next morning. And if you looked at them when they were not dosed with the drug, they felt more refreshed, more awake, following that natural night of sleep. But there's something else that's fascinating in the data if you look. The participants, having had their sleep impacted by THC also started to report suffering from increased negative emotions throughout the day. For example, greater levels of anxiety, greater levels of agitation and irritability, and greater stress and tension. The subjects also reported suffering a significant drop in their energy and their daytime work ability, even their sociality following those drug-dosed nights of sleep, both following THC alone or THC plus CBD. Said in plain speak, after a night of sleep with THC, the study demonstrated that you're going to feel more lethargic, you're going to be more inefficient at work, you're not going to be able to concentrate as well, and you will suffer this sort of form of mental fog, and you also seem to become more socially withdrawn. And when we have asked the brains of those subjects to perform certain tasks following a night of sleep with THC, the brain does seem to spell out a very similar dimmed view, as it were. And here in these studies, we first have participants learn a collection of words before bed. And this is before they've taken any drug. So they're learning drug-free. And then, prior to bed, they take the drug dose. And what we've discovered is that the next day, the subjects following a night of sleep that has been laced with THC, they are unable to recall as many of the words that they had learned the night before relative to a natural night of sleep. In fact, if you look at the data, they ended up losing almost 50% of those memories across the 15 milligram THC-bathed night of sleep. Don't forget, you will recall just a few minutes ago, I mentioned that cannabis and THC will blunt the richness of those bursting brainwaves that are associated with the rapid eye movements that have previously been linked to learning and memory function. And it seems to be this almost larceny of these brimming REM sleep brainwaves by way of cannabis that may be one reason explaining the overnight forgetting rather than remembering that those participants had experienced. And in general, it's the disruption of your REM sleep, both in terms of the quantity and the quality by way of cannabis and THC, that is at least a partial reason that we in the field of sleep science and clinical sleep medicine cannot advocate for it as a sleep aid. But that is not the main reason that we cannot endorse it. There's an even stronger reason. The main medical concern beyond the REM sleep suppression when it comes to sleep problems concerns cannabis tolerance. And as you'll remember from the first episode and the start of this episode, I told you that one of Dr. O'Shaughnessy's patients did not seem to gain any benefit from the THC administration when it came to sleep. And he was very astute because after having interviewed that patient, what he discovered is that the individual was a habitual user of hemp already. And O'Shaughnessy predicted that it was this unfortunate tolerance that had built up due to that chronic habitual use, which resulted in the inability to gain any benefit any longer from that cannabis use. And it is this unfortunate tolerance, which is now very well characterized across many studies, that leads individuals to start escalating their dose to try to get the same sleep benefit, and therefore, the greater the dose, the greater the dependency. And here's the vicious twist in the story tale. Because if you stop using cannabis or THC, and that dependency has developed, you suffer a very consistent and very consequential cannabis withdrawal syndrome, which comes with truly miserable sleep, which is to say, a very substantive form of insomnia. And as a consequence, any of the sleep benefits that you got in the first few nights or the first few weeks of using cannabis as a sleep aid quickly dissolve away. Indeed, that withdrawal insomnia, or what we call a rebound insomnia component, is so reliable, it's so common across almost all users, that it now forms a part of the medical diagnostic criteria for something that we call cannabis use disorder in this big manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And in fact, it has a particular name. It is called cannabis-induced sleep disorder, which refers to precisely that rebound insomnia. When you stop using, you get this vicious difficulty in falling asleep and staying asleep. And if you look at the literature, it is typically described as a prominent and severe disturbance in sleep. A sponsor of today's show is Inside Tracker, which is a service that comes out to your home and they will analyze your blood and your DNA to know precisely what is going on inside of you. Hence the name Inside Tracker. They look at your blood, your metabolic signals, your hormonal health metrics, and then they give you a personalized, actionable set of lifestyle changes in response to that readout. And the goal there is to improve your health. I was looking and informed they have some new cardiovascular and new hormonal biomarkers that I'm particularly interested in. One that I'm focused on is something called ApoB, which is an absolutely critical heart health measure. And I get it done now with them somewhere between 4 to 6 times a year. Why? Well, my family unfortunately has a strong history of cardiovascular disease, so I am checking that pretty ruthlessly. And by the way, I do buy the product myself out of pocket. I don't want to fall prey to any of those trappings and undue incentives. Although with full admission, I still use my own discount code that you can use to get some money off. And that code for you is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. So just go over to insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. And again, if you want to get that discount, it is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. Thanks very much. Now, gobbledygook aside, what does all of this really mean? It means 3 things. First, the insomnia will develop soon after attempted abstinence. So as soon as you stop using and you try to come off cannabis, that insomnia will hit you rather quickly, and it is usually associated with quite disturbing dreams and also nightmares. And so potent is this cannabis-induced sleep disorder that individuals will rank it as the most severe feature of the entire withdrawal process from cannabis. That's the first thing. The second is that it's not just insomnia, it's insomnia of several different types. First, you will sleep less overall. Next, the sleep that you get is going to be fragmented. And that is caused by you waking up many, many more times throughout the night. And that decreases something that we call your sleep efficiency. I should also note, by the way, that some individuals will experience another sleep disorder during cannabis withdrawal that is layered atop of the insomnia, and that is called periodic limb movements, or PLMs for short. And symptoms of periodic limb movements include jerky leg movements and strong twitches, and it results in you waking up more frequently across the night. And of course, unsurprisingly, after not getting sufficient sleep and getting fragmented sleep where you're waking up, you do not feel restored by that sleep. And as a consequence, the next day, you suffer from something that we call excessive daytime sleepiness. We also know that there seems to be a historical, almost like a dose-response relationship, such that all of these symptoms are going to be worse the heavier the cannabis use has been leading up to the attempted abstinence. The third issue comes back to the strange and really quite disturbing nightmares, and those can last quite a long time. In fact, if you look at the data, those strange dreams and those nightmares, they typically will last somewhere up to around 6 weeks in total. Could you imagine 6 weeks of having really quite disturbing, almost nightmare-like dreams? It's really not a pleasant experience to go through. I should note, by the way, that we don't quite know if the sleep abnormalities are reversible and resolve if you continue your journey of abstinence. We just don't have any data one way or the other. So it could equally be the case that, yes, absolutely, the sleep system bounces back and it's no problem, or that there is only a partial rebound or no recovery at all. I think the field has a suspicion, and it is just a suspicion, and a suspicion is south of a fact. And if you are without a fact in medicine, then you're you're up that creek without a particular paddling instrument. However, suffice it to say that it is a very challenging situation once you become dependent on cannabis and THC for your ability to sleep. And then when you try to stop, or even that you try to stop, not necessarily because of any impact on your sleep, but just that you want to stop using during the daytime, you're going to be faced with these sleep challenges at night. And as I'll come on to, that does typically result in a fairly predictable ending. So that's been a lot of information to throw at you, a lot of sleep fact spaghetti thrown against the wall. So let me see if I can provide a synopsis relative to your sleep without cannabis, essentially your sleep au naturel. Your sleep after short-term acute use is that you will have a sleep honeymoon phase. And here, you will typically be falling asleep faster and you will spend less time awake during the night. But then, with continued chronic use, longer-term use, things start to get more challenging. You will start to wake up throughout the night, particularly in the second half of the night. You will also suffer a reduction in your overall sleep efficiency, particularly in the second half of the night as a result. And you will start to undergo that dream sleep deprivation of two different flavors, a reduction in the quantity of your REM sleep and a reduction in the quality of your REM sleep. And as we mentioned, that REM sleep comes with health-related concerns for your brain, learning, memory, mental health, downstairs in your body, hormonal health, and also, of course, your overall longevity, your lifespan. And then finally, we mentioned that when you attempt to stop using cannabis, you will get a very nasty insomnia withdrawal syndrome. It's quite a vicious insomnia rebound. And I told you that the insomnia that comes during attempted abstinence is consistently classified as the single worst feature of trying to come off cannabis. Indeed, if you look at the data, a staggering 60% of individuals who fail in their attempt to quit cannabis and THC use will say that it was the insomnia that happened after they stopped using that was the single most important reason that they relapsed and caused them to start using all over again. And I find this striking for two reasons. First, there are many other challenging factors that influence relapse rates. Of course, things like your relationships, your family, financial problems, social peer pressures. Yet rarely in clinical practice do we ever consider bad sleep to be so elemental as a powerful force dictating the outcome of success versus failure of drug withdrawal attempts. The second reason I find it interesting is that unlike many of these other relapse triggers that can be fiendishly difficult to change, sleep is something that we call a modifiable factor. It is something that we can change. And with the right clinical intervention, for example, using cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia or CBTI, which I've mentioned before, we can perhaps bootstrap the sleep of those individuals when they designate that they would like to try to abstain from drug use. Or said differently, if we place sleep optimization at the heart of any attempted program of cannabis withdrawal, then perhaps larger numbers of people may not suffer the demoralizing fate of relapse when they want to try to stay clean. There is a nasty irony here, which is that most users have no idea that cannabis gradually makes their sleep worse. And furthermore, they feel as though they need to go back to using cannabis to help them fall asleep faster. Because when they stop using, their sleep gets worse and they make an incorrect assumption. They say, well, it must have then been the cannabis that was helping me sleep naturally. Untrue, alas, it was not. They are just unwittingly caught up in a negative dependency spiral that I described earlier, developing that dependency on cannabis for their brain to produce even vaguely normal sleep. And when they stop using it because of the dependency that they have built up, their sleep gets worse, and they never give themselves the chance to return back to the natural state because it's so miserable, so they go back to using again, and so on and so forth goes that unfortunate cycle. Wow, Matt, once again, you are all doom and gloom. Can you imagine how fun I am to hang out with at social gatherings? Jeez. Oh my goodness. If life is a parade, I'd be the rain coming down. I'm so sorry. Except it wouldn't be rain at all. It would be hail. Just hail. Big rocks of hail. Massive. Bad news. Soul-denting hail. You're welcome, listeners. A supporter of today's podcast is a comprehensive nutritional drink that I'm sure you've heard of, and one that I've genuinely been using for almost, 4 years to date, and I continue to use it. That is AG1. AG1, if you don't know, it's a nutritional supplement, and for me, I put it in my shakes that I make, my post-workout shakes. And it contains over 75 different minerals, vitamins, probiotic, prebiotics, you name it, and you consume it every day. By the way, for the record, I do buy my own. I hope that that's a testament, the fact that I'm using it, but also I just don't want to fall into any of the trappings of free product. It's perhaps good to also know that they are registered and approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. They also have GMP, or Good Manufacturing Practice badges and stamps. They are rigorous. So if you want to reshuffle the things that you're taking, such as multivitamins, etc., you can start by trying AG1. And you can try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of both vitamin D and K2. And for listeners of this podcast, you can also get, in addition to those things, 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. So go over to drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. That is drinkag1, all one word, drinkag1.com/Matt Walker, and you can check out there. I do have something that you could consider as potentially, very tentatively, and not for any clinical recommendations, but you could consider it a shade of positive, maybe. My goodness, Matt, how many hedges and disclaimers were in that sentence? I think the best description of the following is that I am somewhat intrigued, shall we say, by the effects of THC on a sleep disorder that we call sleep apnea. As you will remember from this podcast, we have done a series on this sleep disorder called sleep apnea. And here, THC may shift from being an instrument of sleep damnation to one of possible drug development ideas in the future, rather than any notion of using THC or cannabis directly. As you will remember from those previous episodes, apnea means absence of breath. And sleep apnea is a condition where you suffer from some kind of an airway obstruction or a full collapsing of your airway, and you stop breathing during sleep. And the telltale signs there are heavy snoring and waking up gasping for breath. Keep in mind that even a moderate form of sleep apnea will hinder you or stop you from breathing up to 30 times per hour. That's a whopping number, and that's just per hour. So even moderate sleep apnea means you may be suffering a total of 200 apnea events or more across a full night of sleep. And it does come with some really quite marked and serious and grave outcomes if left untreated. And we estimate right now that, in fact, almost 80% of individuals who do have sleep apnea are currently undiagnosed. As, for example, famously, the basketball player Shaquille O'Neal had been for many years before his diagnosis and successful treatment. And I mention this because any treatment that stands to help alleviate the condition stands to save millions of lives in avoiding premature and preventable early death. And this is where things get interesting with THC. Based on some very recent preliminary data, THC seems to have a moderating effect on sleep apnea. It seems to reduce the number, literally, of breathless events. And if you look in the data tables of the early studies in humans using just THC or even just using crude cannabis, buried in there, and you have to go searching for them, you will see the numeric hints of a strange, what would be considered beneficial reduction in sleep apnea events across the night. But what's better is that there is a medically controlled synthetic cannabinoid called dronabinol, and it is predominantly THC based in terms of its compound structure. And because it's synthetic and it is medically pharmaceutically created, it provides a far better test for scientists. And in early animal studies, reports had demonstrated that dronabinol reduces the number of apnea events quite significantly. And if you repeat very similar studies in humans using a dose of that synthetic version of THC, doses range from 2.5 all the way up to 10 milligrams for several weeks, what you see is a modest but still significant 32% reduction in sleep apnea severity relative to placebo. And then an even more stringently controlled clinical study, something that we call a placebo-controlled randomized trial, has now replicated those benefits. And there they reported a 33% reduction in apnea severity across 6 weeks using a 10 milligram dose, almost identical to the 32% in the initial clinical studies. Now, I should note that we do not yet fully understand why THC-based interventions would help reduce the sleep apnea events, but we do have some theories. Those theories currently center on the fact that cannabinoids can lower serotonin activity in the body, which in turn may enhance the stability of respiration in patients and therefore reduce the overall number of those sleep apnea events. So you can see why I find this emerging literature really quite intriguing, especially considering that the original treatment for sleep apnea involved wearing these quite cumbersome face mask devices, and the adherence and the compliance of participants to those very old school face masks wasn't great. However, I should note that the new devices, and these are what we call continuous positive airway pressure devices, or CPAP for short, CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure devices, they have become far far more sophisticated of late. They are far less intrusive. They are now really quite well tolerated, and they will utterly transform the life of a patient. There are also the emergence of dental appliances that can help with jaw alterations or the positioning of the jaw, something that we call a mandibular jaw augmenting device. And those are often used for milder versions of sleep apnea conditions. So why are we not racing out and dosing legions of sleep apnea sufferers with plentiful synthetic cannabis in sleep clinics worldwide? Well, I return to the answer that I gave in the very first episode, right at the beginning. It's complicated. We have no sense of what happens to patients if we give them these types of medications across years. Does the benefit of THC-based synthetic compounds for sleep apnea continue to last? What about tolerance? What about withdrawal upon abstinence? What about the basic and well-known sleep-impairing effects that we've discussed at great length in both of these episodes? Those must be weighed against any upside. And as my dear friend and one of the world's foremost medical doctors, Peter Attia, will always wisely affirm, no drug is completely safe, be it illicit or be prescribed. And as Peter notes in medicine, you must weigh the cost of doing nothing against the potential cost of treating, especially when a new experimental intervention is just first evolving. And with reflection and Peter's wisdom on board, I personally don't foresee sufficient scientific evidence at present that would justify, for example, the board of a set of medical experts, medical doctors, because of course I'm not one of those, so I'm not advocating for anything. All I'm doing here is giving you the scientific descriptive advice, not anything that is prescriptive. But I would think it very hard to assume that any light LITE data that we have now, particularly with all of those concerns that I've just listed, would mean that there is any wise recommendation of the instigation of use. And in fact, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine offers this same stance at the time, at least, of recording this podcast. But still, I think these effects on sleep apnea of THC or the synthetic pharmaceutical grade versions offer some promising potential advance in sleep apnea treatment. Perhaps lower doses of synthetic THC in combination with those CPAP devices may produce a productive step forward in long-term trials. And perhaps that is where the field may be going, or at least we can start to develop other pharmaceutical analogs of THC, perhaps ones that don't have the downside on sleep that I've been describing, but still keep the upside on sleep apnea. I'm getting a little bit excited here. Or at least that's about as excited as we, the British, get. Keep in mind that if you are British, based on your level of restraint, you almost consider, let's say, liking a Facebook photo or an Instagram post as a wild and almost irresponsible expression of unbridled passion. That's the extent of our typical excitability. You are welcome, everyone. And with that, I will say three things. First, I have not forgotten about CBD, and there will be an episode forthcoming down the line. Second, I hope you feel that I've treated this topic with reverence. I have no business telling anyone what to do with their life or how to live their life. I just want to offer you the scientific data, and you can make your choices. And third, I will say thanks so much for listening. You're so lovely to do so. Take care of yourself, take care of those around you, and take care of those in the world. I will see you next time. Bye for now. Thanks very much.